I very miss my brother, my my brother, my brother, I miss my family, my brother, my sister. I very miss my sisters, my sister, brother, my sister.
The food courier industry in Canada and in Toronto consists majorly of migrant workers and international students. Like many other migrant workers, I help put food on the plate of a Canadian.
Greetings, my name is Justin McLean, and this is Blueprints of Disruption. Those opening sounds were from Derailing Dignity, an installation and sound piece by Krish Janesh Kumar that opens in Toronto on May 16th. The exhibit is part of the 40th annual Mayworks Festival of Working People and the Arts, which runs the entire month of May. All of their programming is free and geared towards social justice. The range of mediums used to engage the public is wide. We are lucky to have Krish in the studio to talk about the use of art to start discussions, engage the disengaged, and ultimately build community. I haven't seen the full installation, but I did hear the 7-minute audio it includes. In that short time, Krish was able to convey the struggles of migrant workers in Canada caught up in the gig economy. And most importantly, he humanizes them. One of Krish's main goals is to build empathy. Sometimes he uses art, sound, but almost always it involves food. I learned a lot from talking with Krish, and not just about art and migrant workers, but lessons about taking stock and tending to ourselves that I will hold with me, that I've already found myself using. In a time where we are surrounded by so many urgencies, I hope this discussion gives all of you permission to slow down a bit. And not because we don't have pressing fights in front of us, but because nourishing each other on many levels is part of the larger mission. You'll know what I mean after you've heard my discussion with Krish. And when you're done listening, be sure to open the show notes and find out more about his work, the Mayworks Festival, and the reality of migrant workers in Canada. Good morning, Krish. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on today. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. We're both in sunny dispositions this morning. But can you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience before we start?
Yeah, for sure. I'm a cook. I'm a sound artist. I have kind of enjoyed or had connections to both mediums on a professional front, but also a creative and maybe just a deeper spiritual front, I suppose you could say, for a good chunk of my life. And so as time has passed, and as I've become more kind of politically engaged and informed as well, finding whatever connections there are between sound, between food, between cooking, connection, especially to others, is a thing that I find myself thinking deeply about. And so, yeah, I try to do that through my art practice. I also try and do that through a little bit of organizing and around food. Um, Cooked Until Tender is the name of a cooking program. It's also a bit of a catering service, to help pay the bills. That, yeah, I've used as a tool to use food and think about food and invite conversation around a myriad of things, but food being a centerpiece for it, because we all have to eat, and we all need to be nourished. And it's a good place to start and think about larger ideas, feelings, concerns around so many things, whether it's talking to young men about gender equity and their understanding of themselves as young men in the world, but also letting food being a conduit to talk about food insecurity or nourishing ourselves in a way that feels good and affordable, and accessible. So yeah, there's so many kind of ways to engage with people around food, and so, anyways, those are a few of the things that I like to do or concern myself with.
it's the theme of food is, is obvious when one starts to pour through your work, and obviously your bio, you lead with cook,
Right.
even though we are here to talk about the art that you've created for the Mayworks Festival, and we will definitely talk about that. The theme of food is so obvious. And I am just enamored, honestly, by the way you have been able to take that passion and themes of social justice, economic justice, and just kind of really moved outside the box. And I didn't know we were going to get that from you. I was here to talk, we're going to talk about migrant workers a little bit and the gig economy and the use of art to stimulate conversation around that. But the show, Blueprints of Disruption, is about finding so many ways to insert yourself politically or to build community for a purpose, right? For a particular political purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just so fascinated by that as well, because I was introduced to someone with a real passion for food. I'm not a great cook. I mean, I love food, but I don't have the passion the way that you do. And Santiago, our listeners will remember, was the original producer on this show, and he would work food into every conversation.
Oh.
And I think finding a way to do that, full time or to pay the bills, but generating just kind of the discussions that we need to move folks forward is that's amazing place to be. Not many people can find that
Right.
that intersection of all
Right.
of the things that they love and think are important.
Yeah.
But the installation that we are talking about here, Derailing Dignity, food is also a theme throughout. And I think folks, perhaps when we think of migrant workers, don't think of the aspect of the gig economy, of, the Uber Eats. I'm assuming some of our listeners or our audience knows what the gig economy is, but perhaps not necessarily. So it's like the most precarious work structure, labor formula. It's explained actually in your art piece quite well, considering you only have 7 minutes. But I'm teasing folks. You heard a sampling of it at the very beginning. But Krish, can you explain to folks just like really high level what your art installation is before we get into the how you created it and why?
For sure. Derailing Dignity is an art piece that is speaking to the intersections of exactly what you said, which is the precarity, the challenges, and the questions really that arise when we think not only about what gig work kind of entails and what challenges arise for a person who is in a position where gig work is the only work that they can find or are able to kind of do for a myriad of reasons, as well as being a migrant and the experience of being a migrant, and that tying very intimately into why and how gig work is the lowest common barrier to entry, right, for someone who has recently come to this country and has to deal with all of the administrative hurdles and challenges of what it means to be considered a citizen, considered a skilled worker, considered a legal worker, et cetera, et cetera. And so this piece of sound art, I wanted it to kind of capture not only the very human elements, right? Hearing voices of migrant workers, of migrants in Canada, speaking about their experience and speaking about their challenges, speaking about their hopes and their dreams, but also thinking very kind of deeply about this idea of dignity. And the reason why that came up for me is because I think throughout this process, and as I sit and think kind of more deeply about the way that capitalism impacts us, the way that production impacts us, is like in a moment where we stop and think about the way, I think it's oftentimes easier to see the way in which dignity is robbed of another person. But I also think in that moment and in that experience, there's a very kind of important moment there where we need to think about the way in which dignity is lost for us through the consenting to a larger process as well, right? And so
Our own dignity.
our own dignity, exactly. And so, because I think dignity is a thing that we offer one another and we offer ourselves as well, right? As a result of that kind of balance, I think I wanted this piece to kind of think about what is evoked when you hear the voice of another person, when you hear their emotion, when you hear the timbre of their voice, all of these things, right? And what that does for you on a very kind of base, internal level. Because I think when I was thinking about this piece, it felt, in some ways, it felt easy to think about conveying this message to people who I know are thinking about the intersections of economic justice and social justice, etc. But who I was thinking about when I made this piece is someone who might not be thinking about it, for better or for worse. But I mean, in this case, I guess what I mean is that it may not be intentional, but it just may be a thing that's not present. And so in that, I think at the core of a lot of the work that I do, thinking about what empathy building looks like is the kind of base point for me. And when I think about it in that sense, thinking about how and where we can connect on a very human level to the ways in which, dignity is present or not present, the way in which comforts or discomforts become present as well in our lives. These are all kind of themes that I wanted to explore in this work. And so, that's where you end up hearing voices of migrant workers. There's actually the voice of a migrant worker who was at a rally in 2022, who's speaking very poignantly and very clearly, about the challenges and the demands that migrant gig workers specifically are experiencing and asking for. And that kind of sway between what felt very clear and not abstract, as well as the kind of a little bit more obscure but still very human and emotional kind of voices are really what I wanted to fold into sounds of the city, and sounds of what people specifically on bikes are kind of hearing all the time. The reason why I wanted to specifically focus on the experience of gig workers on bikes is because as more and more time passes, and as we continue to experience and feel heightened levels of xenophobia and racism, particularly around those who are on bikes, who are on e-bikes around the city, there's something visceral about that visual confrontation, right? There are tons of people who drive Uber or drive for Lyft, for example, or who are delivering food who are in cars as well. In fact, I learned that statistically there are more people doing gig work in vehicles than there are on bicycles. But that visual confrontation isn't the same. We don't know who's behind a car, right? It could just be a person.
Anonymous in a car.
Exactly. Whereas on the bike, you see it, and there's that visual kind of element. And so that felt important for me to kind of also focus in on, is that I recognize and acknowledge that gig work is, it's done by more people in cars than it is on bikes, but the visual confrontation felt like an important starting point to think about.
Well, even the bicycle, it's a more precarious form of transportation, one could argue, especially with Toronto trying to remove all the bike lanes, but also, the intersection of class is there, of bike and vehicle. And when we're talking about this intersection of workers, I cannot imagine, other than perhaps maybe sex workers or folks that aren't part of the labor force officially at all, they are, but they aren't. This is very close, right? Especially when one is confronted with some of the facts that one voice is conveying in that short amount of time of how little protections or rights are afforded to the folks delivering the food, our food. And you do a really excellent job. And I don't know if it's because, you repeat some of the phrases are repeated to that it like sinks in, especially I miss my home. I miss my family. I just wanted to make myself better. Really starts to humanize that convenience. And that's when you start to feel that perhaps it is a degradation of our dignity, because it's easy to remove ourselves from that, right? Like it's just a convenience. We hit a few buttons, the food is delivered. We do see a person, we tip the person well, but that isn't a deeper understanding of what's this unsustainable labor practice that you talk about.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I think, what you said there, I think felt like such a important thing that, I wanted to convey, which was like, I think it feels clearer to think about how undignified it might be for this kind of experience for a gig worker to simply be like picking up food from, from a set of likely another migrant's hands who've made this food in the back of a kitchen, who received that food from another migrant who was working on a farm across Ontario, across Canada. But then once they come to your doorstep, more often than not, it's like leave the bag at the door, right? And so, as a person who's receiving that food or who's placed that order, they're not only just a name on the screen, but you don't see their face, you don't see their smile or have a chance to say hello or say thank you. I'm sure there's larger conversations around niceties versus kindness and an act of kindness. But I actually I do want to argue that those very small things are beyond a nicety, and it's actually more about an acknowledgement of like what this exchange is, right? And when you think about what our relationship to food is, we think so much about, okay, yeah, it's nourishing, right? It's nourishing us, right? What does it mean for that food, for this thing that is so nourishing and significant and meaningful, a necessity in our lives, to be brought to us by another human who has traversed the city in a risky way on a bike, where there are, a now reduction of bike lanes happening and an increasing kind of tension between cyclists and bikers, etc. Like all of this stuff happening. And that just ends with like a bag being dropped at a door and that person walking away and having to do it again, all throughout the night. Like, what does it do for us to like not have a chance to like look that person in the eye and say, have a good night, like get home safely, I think there actually is something that impacts us in that process too. And that felt really, really important to kind of to sit with and for the art piece to explore a little bit.
Oh yeah, we're missing out on so many levels, like the relationship building, the acknowledgement of the food chain even, but then the knowledge of how this is having a larger impact. Sometimes you sit and you jab with a cabbie, right? You talk, you hear where they're from. I mean, I do. I just talk their ear off if they'll have me. And you find out their story, and it's much more human. And I guess I'm of the generation, and I guess maybe my setting, where if you are ordering food, it's like the pizza guy. It's still the old school. There's a handoff and maybe even a little conversation. I wasn't aware of how removed Uber and some of these food delivery services are. I get annoyed too. I'm in a rural area. Often when we think of migrant workers, I'm going to feed into the trope that it's all agricultural workers, right. But that bothers me too. I feel like not understanding or giving all the credit to predominantly white landowners as feeding our cities, farmers feeding our cities in this heightened era of xenophobia where migrants are scapegoated as the problem. And then hearing your piece and coming to the realization that they are almost the entire food chain for us.
Yeah.
And that, it gives me feels. They're not good ones,
Yeah.
So no wonder you're looking to maybe use alternative means to reach people. Because, like my audience right now, you're probably preaching to the choir a little bit in terms of talking about the precariousness of migrant work. But there's a lot of people out there whose ire in their circumstances is directed at this precarious set of humans.
Exactly.
Even as I call them gig workers, that feels a little dehumanizing in itself.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's where a new kind of class system, I mean, not new, but it becomes intensified, right? Our understanding of class, as you said, right, is like, what distinction is there between a person who is delivering food on a bike versus in a car, right? There are now systems where, the more you kind of take a look at what sort of bikes folks are riding, you'll start to see there are certain kind of types of bikes, certain companies that are leasing bikes or financing bikes, right? It's like it's a different system of what it might look like to lease a bike versus to lease a car, right? If you're coming here and financially are trying to figure things out. And so, yeah, I mean, I had a chance to speak with folks from Justice for Migrant Workers, and one of the things that was even shared with me was that, like, bikes are actually the primary mode of transportation for migrant workers in rural parts of the country who are getting around to work on farms as well. And so, it felt like an important kind of tool, an important kind of part of this message. But to your point as well, right, is like, yeah, migrant workers are at every stage and every step of our like food system, let alone like so many kind of systems that make up this kind of capitalist system here in Canada, in the world, really. But like, how frustrating is it as and when you feel the xenophobia, the racism kind of continue to grow, the anti-migration sentiments continue to grow, when, like, I'm not going to say it's all it takes, but like, what would it look like for a prominent political figure, a prominent social figure to be like, hey, everyone, just letting you know, we bring migrants here to work for cheap so that we can keep our economy moving. Like, this is a very intentional thing. This is not some invasion that's taking place. We're very well aware.
You want them to own up to it, Krish.
We have a very clear administrative legal system, immigration system, that makes it incredibly difficult for people to come here to use skill sets, education, experiences that they've gained in other parts of the world, to devalue it and make clear that you can come here and you can work these incredibly exploitative jobs, these incredibly low paying jobs, these jobs and setups that do not provide you the most basic comforts, basic necessities even, and will isolate, and we won't do anything to make clear to the public that this is not some kind of alien invasion that's taking place, and that your jobs are being taken away. Because in fact, we've drawn a lasso around what jobs we will afford you. What would it look like for that to be clearly outlined? Is I think is a question that, and a frustration that kind of came up for me in the process of putting this together.
It is a bit of a conundrum, too, even for folks who understand that it's an exploitive system, perpetuated by the federal government and, the needs of capital. I'm using scare quotes. But there's a difference between that and also knowing what to do about it. Exactly. Some folks will call for the whole system to just be abolished. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't be bringing migrants here just to exploit them. Mm-hmm. And, there's validity in the thought process there, but folks like Migrant Rights Network mm-hmm. and other organizations are calling for full status.
Yes.
When people visit your installation, will they be given any other information other than the input that you've put there in terms of sight and sound?
There will be a kind of text exchange, which, in fact, will kind of highlight a little bit of what we've kind of spoken about today, to kind of dive into some of those extra bits. And in fact, I'll be doing kind of private opening prior to the more public opening at the tail end of this week. Just for migrant workers, not only the ones that I've been connected to, but I've actually found my way into a group chat, a WhatsApp group chat of about 700 odd gig workers who have all been connected as like a means of buying and selling bike parts, but also communicating to one another about what's going on, how Uber is today, whether it's busy, whether it's slow. It's a bit of a communal space, but to invite workers to come out. And I'll actually have some folks from Justice for Migrant Workers come join me as well, to be able to engage with workers as well, to kind of do twofold, right? To be able to build relationships and also, again, kind of disrupt this this glass wall that can feel is present between, workers and people who are maybe not in working roles or who are Canadian, right, who live here with status, but to also invite the conversations around what might it look like to think about participating and organizing collectively towards working through a lot of these political challenges, right? And what it looks like to challenge and have more people kind of come together and think about what challenging for status for all looks like, challenging what it looks like for, companies like Uber or DoorDash to up wages, to provide more worker protections, to provide benefits, right? I think it's a very slow burning process, but I think what I really wanted to instill or have invite folks to think about is what kind of feeling comes up for you when you're kind of confronted with the idea that, like, this is not only an incredibly precarious situation for migrant workers, for migrants and gig workers, but it's also like one of the many kind of places in our lives and our current kind of existence on Earth where things are being shaken and crumbling in many ways, right? And dignity is the one thing that kind of comes back to, is like, this is a crumbling of our dignity everywhere. And if it makes you feel something emotionally, like, to me, that's a really important starting place, right? It's not, I'm not here to punish you, I'm not here to judge you. The sound art is not here to say like you are inherently wrong, but it's to say, if this is bringing up something for you, like, listen to that. Sound is an important tool to get people to listen, right?
Well, there's nothing
Yeah.
accusatory in the audio.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling that, that is something to explore. There's a certain
Exactly.
discomfort we all have to move through, but it really is from the perspective of migrant workers.
Yeah.
How many different migrant workers do I hear when I've heard the whole, I think, just over 7 minutes?
Yeah. So there are three voices that you hear. One is a lovely someone I consider a friend, named Blaise Rosario, who came to Canada in 2018 from Bangladesh, and he has been such a support in this project. He's someone that I've worked closely with and built a meaningful relationship with a couple times, where I'm fortunate to have access to a car, and I just said, hey man, why don't we do a shift together? Why don't we just spend the day driving around the city? Like, you open up the app, and instead of biking around, I'll drive you to wherever the orders come, and we'll just spend the day together. Being able to do that, was not only the most insightful, but it was like, 4.5 hours together of just driving around, talking together, learning not only about him, but his experience as well. And so, a lot of the tape that you hear is his voice, is him talking.
Is that him at the rally?
It's not him at the rally. So
Okay.
the individual you hear at the rally, unfortunately, I've not actually gotten to know them or their name. They're someone who had previously, or maybe continues to organize with Gig Workers United. They were a member of Gig Workers United who was speaking at this rally. And the last member is someone who very recently came to this country, who asked to remain anonymous for this project, but they've only been here for less than a year, and are still not only practicing and learning the English language, despite comfortably speaking many other languages, and trying to find work as a translator because of how skilled they are in speaking all of these other languages, but who's also an avid gardener. And there's a poignant line that I felt was so important to keep in, which is, he was trying to, he was talking about what it's like to come here and think about gardening and wanting to garden again. And I asked him, how has that been for you, trying to acclimatize to a different place? And, he said he was trying to find the words in English, and I don't speak very good French, but I know that he spoke French as well. And I was like, if you want to say it in French, if that's easier. And he says, do you know what la terre is? The earth. He says, la terre, it's so different. It's so different here. And that just felt very profound. It felt like he was talking about more than just the soil, and the geographical kind of context of this place, as much as it is what it feels like for a person to come from, Central Africa and be confronted with like a Canadian winter, to be confronted with the Canadian public and life here, trying to find work, etc., etc.
For a gardener, though, even he could just have been talking about the dirt. Just that
Absolutely.
would be disorienting. That's where you are. Your hands are in it. You understand it. You know what works, what doesn't work with the plants. And
Exactly.
it's such a metaphor,
It is
though,
truly,
especially
truly a
when you're
metaphor.
looking at this as a big project.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, you make friends with some of these folks, you hear so much from them, and then you've got to pick and choose which will be the most powerful in the set of time. Did you give yourself 7 minutes, or, can you help walk me through, what did you say earlier? Making what you were called to make,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And because you must have so much of their stories you think are interesting and we should all know about, right? Like just dying to tell the world. Because I feel like I don't leave much on the cutting room floor. I mean,
Right.
you genuinely hear most of the conversation I have with folks, but I know so much more about them from diving in, and I just can't fit it in an hour or 40 minutes. And so, what you must have left so much on the cutting room floor. That's I don't like doing that. That actually hurts. Like when I have to take people's words out, I usually promise I won't. But if there's something I can't, I'm not a very good sound editor. I miss Santiago. So I sometimes have to take phrases out. And I don't like that. How did that feel, having to kind of cram these three people into the most powerful 7 minutes you could?
Yeah. I first want to say I'm with you. I'm team no edits. Mostly because I come from a philosophy and a place where I'm like, everything is important, you know? Sure, in the world of podcasts and entertainment, it's about keeping it concise, etc. But I'm like, I am a firm believer that in the things that are not said, that there's something said, in the way that someone says something, in the pauses, in all of those, there's so much to kind of hear, and there's nothing that isn't important. Um, but in this case, I think what I wanted to think about was I can how I can make this feel all encompassing, and by that I mean to say, how can I talk about, or how can I convey the very political nature of this work, why this work exists in the first place, and where it is not only challenging but yeah, really precarious and dangerous in many ways, right? As a system, um, I wanted to convey the very emotional elements and the very kind of highs and lows of the work, not only on a personal front for these workers and what it looks like to come to Canada and need to navigate all of this, but also what like the day to day is like. And I think the thing that felt really important was to also clearly capture like where the heads are at of the folks that I was able to build relationships with, and to make clear that like it's double edged, right? Is like on one hand, I want you to, and I want people who are listening to care very deeply, not only about the individuals who I was fortunate to record, but migrant workers and gig workers in general, but to also like remember that like these are people who have dreams and hopes, and beyond that, like look outside the window and see that the sun is shining and feel joy just like the rest of us. There's I don't want to be woo woo and just say like we're all human, but like to actually at least think about that very you know I guess defining characteristic that we share in common, is that they are people just like us. And so thinking about those kind of three things is where I started, and just listening through all of that audio allowed, is where I kind of was able to pick out those things. And so that's why you hear, one of the workers say like, I like to smile. I like to hand the food to someone. I like to say thank you, or I like to receive a thank you, and to like say, have a good day. It's that felt important because it's just like, hey, yes, on one hand, I can imagine there are so many instances where, that person is also feeling like, God damn, like this is hard and I'm not getting paid enough and this sucks. But to also be like, no, in this small act of service, I feel compelled to like look a person in the eye and to hand them their food. There's an understanding that there's still an opportunity for connection even in this kind of difficult moment, right? Like what is that besides telling of a person's humanity and their heart, right? To say I want to still connect in this way.
Because people work all day, they need something to show for it other than a paycheck, right? Like if you build a building and it was really hard, you can look back and be like, this is in the community. It stands tall. There is my work there. There is my time away from my family. Like there is a purpose to this job, no matter how hard it is. And
Exactly.
for them not to be able to connect and see that purpose, see that you brought joy and nourishment to folks. Now I'm starting to understand even more the derailing of dignity there, because how hard would that be to work? Like doctors, all these people get to see the impact of their work.
Yeah.
But this is one of the jobs out there where you can clearly point to like just this inhumane detachment.
Yeah. It's an inhumane detachment. And, I'm realizing now it's also important to pin some of that blame and that responsibility on the companies as well, because not only is there this kind of disconnect where a person may not have a chance, a worker is just kind of dropping food off or groceries or whatever it is, and then having to go, but they're also getting dinged on their app to be like, it's time to go. If you don't take this order right now, you're losing out on 10, at that point, it's like, it could be $5, it could be $30. Like, and if, depending on how your night is going, like that $5 could be substantial. Right. And so not only is it this kind of instance where there's this anonymity, this ghostness, this lack of human connection that's made, but it's also like, you got to get back to it, and so psychologically, that is so tormenting, right? To think about how it's just like, not only in this moment do I have to choose between like pausing for a moment to like take a deep breath, or to like say hello to a person, or to like engage in conversation if there is room for that, but I'm now in this place where I'm like, listen, I just don't even know if talking to people is worth it, because like it's probably better for me to just be ready to bounce and pick up this next order and keep it moving. That is an experience that I think so many of us actually feel in our work lives and in our lives.
Our notifications,
our
right?
notifications, exactly. There's
Ding.
so much of that, right? It's like it torments us psychologically and emotionally in ways that I don't think we talk about enough, and so all of that felt really important to convey.
The more I allow you to like unpack that, we've been talking 36 minutes here, not solely about a 7-minute audio, but
Sure.
I mean, crikey, I feel like we could unpack that for a long time. Now I'm thinking back to the sounds. I should have just played it in the loop in my head the whole interview, but you do such a good job. I messaged you saying it felt really hectic, right? Yeah. Like I felt, like just, I didn't know where it was coming from, but it's how you work that sound, right? It is that notification going off, but it's the start and stop and start and stop and start and stop. And so you felt like uneasy, but at the same time, you're connecting with humans in a way. And so there was like this soothing nature to it, but still always in the background are those notifications, and they're just thinking about what you're talking about, and all of it being so electronic as well.
Yeah.
Right. Even they're tracked and they're timed, and they've got an ID number in this giant system that's just proliferating profits for the very few. And we've really just kind of looked at it as this amazing convenience that's showed up at our door. And
exactly. That's exactly right. First,
it's easy
and
not to do a deep dive on it, right? That's hard. That's uncomfortable.
That's exactly right. And I think, a part that felt really important to convey as well is that there's like room for multiple truths. And that's why I feel very fortunate to have found that kind of audio of the gig workers speaking at the rally, because, they said something so important and so true, which is that like, it is true that for many people, like having access to a delivery service is an accessibility need, for many people, it actually offers a convenience, or beyond a convenience, it addresses a need, and in thinking about it in that way, it's like two things can be true. It's a need for many, and it's also a convenience for many. It's also a thing that we don't think about in the same way that it's like, okay, order something off of Amazon because it will show up in a day, not thinking about how there's someone who's probably working overnight to make sure it comes to you, right? And having to live in a disrupted circadian rhythm, for lack of a better kind of word. It's yeah, you're right. There's so much that could be said.
I'm glad you kind of made that correction there, because you're right. It definitely is an accessibility thing. And
Yeah.
there is a moment in the audio where you mention, or sorry, you don't, but COVID is mentioned.
Yes.
And the
Yeah.
phrase is after COVID, but they mean the onset of this like new way of doing things. And that included having to stay at home, and
Yep.
some people already have those needs and were just generally not serviced
Mm-hmm.
sufficiently. But it created a greater need, which passed the threshold, so that
Yes.
we created an entire economy now around delivering food and other things right to our doors. But that's all come at a cost.
Yeah.
You say that it's not you, like as though like this is some sort of hot take, but that it's an unsustainable. Can we unpack that a little bit? Like, what does it look like when we've hit unsustainability? Like, how does this crumble then?
Unsustainability, I think, is a thing that I was thinking about, not only in a material sense, but also on a kind of on an internal front. The emotional, the mental, the spiritual, and this stuff I think feels very important, and I think is the thing that I want to be thinking about when I think about organizing and I think about doing political work with people, because of how oftentimes secondary a lot of those things kind of feel and sometimes can be made out to be, right? By no one's intention, but I think it can feel sometimes, I think, thinking about kind of action and work in this way, it needs to be embodied, right? And I think it being connected to where we're at on so many fronts feels important. And so where it feels unsustainable is because is you're going to kind of have so many people working in a I mean, already is the case where I'm like, yes, there are so many new migrants who've come to Canada who are looking for work, who are looking for status, etc. But as folks become more and more siloed into, kind of skilled work, right? Work that, the country legally allows migrants to work. There's literally only like so many people who can kind of deliver in a day before people, rightfully so, should be fed up to be like, why have I only made $40 today, even though I've spent all day outside in the sun, in the rain, in the snow to get food to people? And why am I feeling in competition with other people who are similarly to me, just like trying to live comfortably and trying to build a life for themselves here? If we don't already feel it, that tension is only going to grow more. On the other side of it, from a public perception, it's only going to grow more as there are more and more folks who need to work and end up taking on roles as gig workers or on bikes, etc. Public sentiment is only going to grow more and more and more around the city. Feels, the language is always coded. It's like, there's too many bikers on the road. It's getting congested. Like all these guys with their backpacks. It's like, we know what you're saying, right? And when that is kind of going unchecked, as I said earlier, like where are the politicians saying, listen, folks, we need to clear up the air here. We're in on this, that tension is only going to grow more and more, and we're only going to see even more kind of violence and judgment and segregation kind of take place. And then the last element is, what's happening for us internally? Like if we are not only experiencing this kind of dissonance with people who we have, yes, transactional relationships with, but ones where there is still room for even the smallest intimacy of like looking a person in the eye and like waving and saying hello. But what does that mean for our relationships in general, right? What does it mean for like how and where relationships with anyone looks like, and what might it even look like for folks who are organizing, right? To be like, if we're here just to do this task, where is that even moment where we look one another in the eye and we say,
The
are
human
you okay?
element.
Yeah, the very human element, right? That for me is I don't want to say the most concerning, but all of it, right, is equally concerning, because if we're collectively psychologically kind of in a place where this connection is something that we can't, we don't have a threshold for anymore, then we're in some real trouble. And maybe for me, why it feels important to talk about this stuff, and it's a part of why it feels important in Cooked Until Tender to address this, is because I'm like, it's very little things that we can do, you know. It's very little things that we can do. The how are you doings are one thing, but to sit and to cook together and say, like, just for today, like, we have no broader goal besides learning how to make gnocchi from scratch, and that's it. That's it.
Yum.
That's it for today, you know. And the fact that we're holding this dough together, and that I might maybe, you know, with your consent, place my hands over yours to show you how this feels, to embrace this connection in this little way, you know. It does something. It does something for us mentally and emotionally, spiritually as well.
Of
So
course
yeah,
it
I
does.
think
Of course it does.
sustainability on all of these fronts is maybe what comes to mind for me.
It's a powerful moment for me, Krish, honestly. I can be quite, I think sometimes so focused on, hence the name, just the disruptive elements
Yeah.
of organizing and not the other things that
Mm,
genuinely kind of organically build the
yeah.
community we need. We talk about it with tenant organizing a lot, like just
Yeah.
create a third space, have a
Yes.
movie night, because when people get together and they do human things in a relaxed setting, they naturally politicize themselves
Yes.
into communities, which is all we really need. It's not a matter of left or right. I mean, there's nuance there. I'm not going to get into that. But
Sure.
really, what we need most first is community back, right?
Yeah.
We've moved towards individualism and lost sight of
Mm-hmm.
our humanity in so many ways. And here's me realizing gig workers also tend to work alone,
Yep.
completely alone, and so removed from any other co-worker,
Mm-hmm.
unless they do the work themselves, right? Organize the way that they are into
Mm-hmm.
unions and little social groups and stuff like that. And they're removed from their home as a
Yep.
migrant worker, right? They are literally without their family as well. And sometimes you at least trauma bond at work, even the most awful jobs, there's at least someone to look over and say, oh my God, like
Yep.
we'll at least get through the day together.
Exactly.
But how isolating for the worker. And then, by proxy, we become more and more isolated. But can we explore that more, from a lot of activists and organizers listening who are probably having a bit of a moment to realizing that we tend to deprioritize some of these ways of organizing. Like, we know that they should exist and we work little elements in here and there, but I think to things like Cooked Until Tender on its own, it's not a
Mm.
means to an end. It's a revolutionary tool in itself. Do you want to talk about this a little bit more, and the other ways that perhaps you have been organizing outside the box this way, and like feeding our souls, like both literally and figuratively?
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, I think, and it's a thing that I keep thinking about and feel a lot of tension around, because there are often moments where I feel like, I'll be honest, there are moments where, when I feel this urge and this need for not even just a slowing down, but to say, like, well, to think, to feel compelled to spend time with people out, knowing that we all care about many things, and want to work towards seeing changes in many ways, but also wanting to just spend time with you in a non-action oriented way. I will admit that I still feel a lot of internal tension, a lot of guilt. To say, Krish, man, like, you're just lazy. You just want to chill. Like, that's all this is, right? But at the same time, I'm also like, you know, there are, and I say this with utmost love, for so many people that I engage with and that I care to work with, and to who I consider allies and comrades, that I'm like, I can sense and feel the, like, vibrational discomfort when I am in your presence. And I think I can feel that. I'm like, the first thing that comes to me is just like, when was the last time you had a chance to just sit down with someone in, like, a park, maybe even in silence, and, like, take a few deep breaths? What does it look like for us to like maybe think about doing some of that together and feel like that's like a very integral part of how we continue this work together, it feels hard to say aloud, because the last thing I want is to make someone think that like their care and their energy and their commitments, that especially their commitments are invalid and that they've got it all wrong, versus wanting to say to someone, hey, like I actually just think your heart deserves like a moment for itself to be tended to, because like we can't lose your heart, we can't lose people's hearts in this work. And so that feels hard. It feels hard to convey because everything feels urgent, and it feels painful, and it feels like action and action and action is what is needed. And I believe that, but I guess I wonder to myself, like what is, what kind of heart work also becomes a part of action as well, and if that's a role that I can play, then I want to play that,
You're speaking right to me.
Mm,
And I feel like there's going to be a lot of people that's hitting.
mm,
And especially in these times where
yeah.
we became so isolated and got used to being isolated in a
Mhm.
lot of different ways. And the urgency has never felt more
Yeah.
real, right? It's, between the rise of fascism and just the
Mhm.
ongoing genocide. I mean, you've
Mhm.
got all our comrades out there feel like they're in this space, right?
Yeah.
That there really can't be enough rest for us at this moment, even though we don't have time for it,
Mhm. Mhm.
And I say rest is revolutionary.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
encourage it, but I feel the same way
Yeah.
when I take time and touch grass and garden and be with my children, even my own children, where I've got a duty to raise. Like, surely I can understand the value in that, and I do, but I still feel like this is time away from the fight.
Yeah.
And I have some work to do, my friend. I have some work to do
Yeah.
in nourishing my own humanity, I feel like. So
Yeah. And yeah, it's so, that feeling, I'll tell you this, the feeling that comes up for me, and this is like, my own kind of judgment voice, right? Which is like, oh, how unprincipled of you, Krish, to not want to, to not want to talk about what we're planning to do next month or how we're going to tackle XYZ issue, And that in itself, right, is such a dangerous and harsh voice, right? This is
that's
like, this is,
capitalism talking, right? You're not
it's,
producing anything
yeah,
of material value.
yeah, that's exactly right, and it infiltrates the spaces and the way in which, we tackle this work that is oftentimes, is trying to counter and wants to counter and challenge and reject capitalism as a system. But oftentimes, the thing that I will always return to, and it felt important to make a part of this artwork too, is like we have we feel uncomfortable all of the time. We feel uncomfortable for so many reasons, from the political to what's going on in our personal lives, our past traumas, things that we experience on the day to day. There's so much that makes us uncomfortable, um, but we can't run from it, you know. And I think sometimes I worry and I think about how action can oftentimes be a way in which we soothe the discomfort. And I think in a broader sense, like, yes, of course, to address a discomfort and understand it as a part of a systemic way in which we are made to feel this discomfort, to act is a way to mitigate and to reject the way in which that discomfort is imposed on us, But there's also a lot of discomfort that action doesn't necessarily solve, Perhaps the stillness is what solves, And that's so hard. That's so hard.
Stillness?
Yeah.
When do I have time for stillness?
Right, right. That's right. And more importantly, like what is, if I'm thinking this of myself about, how I'm not being principled, I'm not being urgent enough, like, I know I'm not the only one who thinks this way. But also, if everything is urgent, then is everything really urgent? I don't know. These are the kind of questions that I find myself wondering. And so, yeah, I'll admit I feel a bit vulnerable as I share this out loud, because the last thing I want is for anyone to take away from this being like, oh, like I'm telling people to chill out, and to stop their work. But I think in a different way, I think it is a thing that I'm going to continue to do, which is to ask ourselves what in small in what may seem in small ways we can collectively and individually as well, like embrace what discomforts kind of come up for us and think about the ways in which um, we can sit with them. We can acknowledge them for what they are. We can kind of do that heart work as necessary, to keep going, to keep practicing love, to keep practicing empathy, to not lose ourselves and our minds and our hearts in this work, because we'll be doing it over our lifetimes, right?
Well, I think in finding more ways to interact with one another, more organic ways, like we spoke about, cooking together,
Yeah.
experiencing art together,
Yeah.
sitting in a park with one another. If we started viewing that as the very organizing that we think we should be getting back to,
Yeah.
it would be wholly different. And I think you've found a lot of ways where it doesn't have to be even, it's subtle, but not so, I mean, like, there's nothing subtle about the art installation,
Sure.
right? Like,
Yeah.
folks should be hit with a message there. But the cooking class, I think, or just catering with a purpose there,
Yeah.
just finding different ways that, you get more than one person in a room together, doing something together.
Yeah.
And the fruits of that will be obvious once you get through them.
Yeah.
It seems like an abstract, and we maybe don't prioritize those types of activities over the more urgent sounding activities and or budget for them, perhaps. Then it's because we're not doing a great job about seeing that value. Not as it's like a personal flaw, it's built into us, but there are a lot of ways that we could, take some of the tips that you're providing us and find a balance. There's like action work, community work, there's the heart work that you talk about. I love that. I wrote that down. I underlined it. And obviously drew a big heart around it. That's a new phrase for me, to be honest. That's how much work I have to do. Yeah, there's even your most militant organizations out there with crazy urgency that we can understand really need to slow down in some parts or find other human elements to add to the get-togethers.
Yeah, I will say, I think, and you brought up that word slowing down, and I know that's for me is where saying that aloud or talking about that aloud is where I feel the most uncomfortable, because of we talk about urgency, a need to act and think and move quickly and be diligent, and so I always get afraid to think about slowing down. But when I ask myself, like, what is it actually that I'm saying to slow down? Am I saying to like do your work slower? Not actually, and I know that that's not what you've insinuated either. I think what I'm actually saying or thinking about when I'm asking about slowing down is presence.
Yeah.
Is to actually
living in the now, right? Like,
a little bit of that, right? But presence to also be like, my ankle hurts, I should sit down for a second. I feel pain in my chest, let me take a few deep breaths. I feel overwhelmed in this moment. Let me tap on another person's shoulder and just say, hey, I just need a moment, I have a busy day today and I've made another commitment for tomorrow. Maybe I should message that friend and say, hey, or, the group and say, I know we have a meeting. I think I might need to sit this one out. Is it okay if I collect notes or whatever it is after the fact, That's like, yes, it's slowing down, but it's coming by way of like taking stock, right? Taking an inventory and being present. And I think
we take care of our vehicles that way.
Sure.
We know to stop and get an oil change maybe before it starts flame or whatever happens when you don't, or, you take preventative measures. We understand that. And then we remind each other all the time that it is a long fight that we're in, that even though there is urgency and immediate needs for folks right now, it is a long fight. And I experience burnout as an autistic person a lot. So I relate that to pulling back when you know you need to pull back, or you'll actually be useless to everybody if that's what your main concern is, like how much work you're putting into the group. You won't be the same value, right? You won't be coming from it in the most humane way that you need to, right? Full of empathy for yourself as well. Yeah. We have a lot to give other people, especially activists, right? Like most people don't organize and do that if they're lacking in empathy. Sometimes it's an overwhelming sense of empathy, and we forget about ourselves. We don't just deprioritize, some of these activities we're talking about, but like just our own well-being at the cost of, and that is the cost to the movement overall.
Right. Exactly. And I think all of this feels so tied to a part of what I wanted to share in this art piece, which is not necessarily to speak towards activists and organizers and people who are thinking about this, but to folks who, I know these feelings of overwhelm, this doubt, the judgment, etc. It's like it's felt by people who are not organizing, who are maybe not thinking about these things at all. But I know, and I imagine that for many people, like, as I was talking about in terms of action being a way to soothe a sense of discomfort, inaction can also do the same, is to also like turn a blind eye is also a way in which you soothe that kind of discomfort that's there, right? And so the thing that I'm talking about here, or presence, right, is neither of those things, right? Inaction and inaction are kind of two sides of the same coin, but presence is an opportunity to like sit with both ways that your body, it's sit to with both ways that your body wants to go, which is like, I want to just go under my sheets and like not have to think about the world around me, or I need to be out in the streets right now and push past whatever discomfort, maybe even bodily, mental, anything that's there for me, because I have a duty to the people, or a cause, or a sentiment that like I believe in very deeply, right? I'm not saying I'm not getting in the way of anyone who I have no desire to get in the way of anyone who sees direct action and action in general. That's not by any means what I want to do here. But to also invite, right, what it looks like to have those moments of pause, really, right? It's a much larger thing, which I know that I'm also continuing to work on articulating well, but I'm okay with this kind of being a work in progress, I'm thankful to even talk about it with you here.
We're all a work in progress. We are all a work in progress. And I think even people listening, I think you've been very clear, and there's a big fight to be had, and this is just one of the tools. It's not to take away from any of the other tactics that folks go around, because building community and power from below. You got to eat if you're going to fight.
Everybody's got to eat. Absolutely. And what better way, I think tied to all of this, tied to presence, tied to this kind of slowing down, tied to action that isn't driven by a kind of next step. All of that is actually a trust building, it's a trust building exercise to look a person in the eye and say, you may not be at our next meeting or our next protest or the next event, but I still care about you. I still have love for you. And the only thing I want is to be able to see you here again, And if we can like start from there as a point to be like, the only thing I care is to see you again. I think that like that speaks to the little kids in us who are wanting to be loved and wanting to be cared for, right? And we need that,
And to those folks who feel like maybe they don't have anything to give, that isn't true. But I get comments all the time, I'm disabled, I'm stuck at home, what can I do for the movement? I can't be out on the streets. And if we just shifted the way we organize a little bit, or added some of these elements, it makes it so much more accessible to people. Not as a next step, but just, again, community building, right? Bringing as many people into the tent as possible, not because they have something to give or contribute, but just because we absolutely need as many of us in it as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah, because there's a lot of folks who feel like they don't have a political home or a community around them in these times. And we kind of forget about those folks, I think, sometimes when we're
Yeah.
organizing. We've got the people at our disposal and we try to bring in recruits, but for an ends. But we're leaving people behind with that as well.
Yeah. And what do we want as our end goal but to live with everyone, right? Comfortably.
dignity.
And with our dignity attached. Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Krish. I mean, this conversation went so far beyond the art installation, but I do want to remind people again that you can experience this installation on May 16th. It runs for an entire week. And if you go into the show notes, you will find a link to the where and the schedule and a little bit more about Krish and all of the things that he does. I mean, he just gave you a sampling at the beginning of the episode when he introduced himself. Even though we got great detail, that was just a tasting. It was just a tasting. I'm so eternally grateful. Honestly, there's some interviews that I learn my own lessons really deeply and I carry them through. And I absolutely know that this is going to be one of them, Krish. Thank you so much. I hope to incorporate as much of this into the work that I do as I can. I felt very impacted by the audio that you sent me to listen to, which I listened to over and over and over again. It's kind of mesmerizing, but even more so in the last hour, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and just for having, creating a really kind of comfortable place to think through and talk about some of these things with you as well. I think, even on this, well, I think just that idea, right, of there always being more work to do, right, is to remind myself, to remind you, to remind anyone who might be listening that, like, yeah, we have every kind of day ahead of us, right, to slowly pick away at it. And so there's no need to punish or judge yourself for where things may feel hard, but to just invite what we can kind of pick away at every day, and to invite that with people around us. I think one thing that I heard at a symposium for music and mental health earlier this year, and it was just from an audience member during the Q&A that kind of unprompted just said, people don't care about what you know until they know that you care. And I think about how important that is when I think about this work. And so, yeah, while I want to look at, the young men that I work with in my cooking program and be like, disrupting all senses of gender norms and the way that the patriarchy works is something that we need to smash, and destroy and crush and disseminate and collectively work together to challenge. I also want to just look at them and be like, hey, what were you listening to this week? What music are you enjoying? Like, did you cook anything at home this week? How's your family doing? Let me start there. And if all I do over my lifetime is keep asking those questions and let a person know that, I see them and I care about them, then, I know eventually that they'll care to know about what I have to say as well. So I hope we can offer ourselves that kind of care and thought as well.
At the bare minimum.
At the bare minimum.
Thank you, Krish, very much.
Thank you, Jessa. Really appreciate it.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Until next time, keep disrupting.